When we talk about the future of the global economy, too often the conversation revolves around policies, markets, or technology, as if those are the only levers capable of shaping the direction of history. But in reality, the most powerful force at work is one that moves quietly, invisibly, and relentlessly: demographics. Numbers don't lie, and populations do not shift overnight. They move in long, predictable waves that no government decree or corporate strategy can fully reverse once they gain momentum. The global shift we are experiencing today is being powered not just by economics or innovation, but by the sheer inevitability of demographic transformation. In the West, we see populations aging at a pace never before witnessed in human history. Entire economies are built on the assumption of perpetual growth. But what happens when the very workers who sustain industries retire in massive numbers, and when the tax base that funds governments begins to shrink? By 2030, nearly 1 in 3 citizens in some developed nations will be over the age of 60. That is not just a statistic. It is a revolution in social structure. It changes consumption patterns. It alters housing markets. It reshapes healthcare systems. And it shifts political priorities. Older populations spend differently, save differently, and vote differently. And this transformation cannot be undone by a policy memo or a central bank decision. You cannot make people younger again at the same time in Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America. There is an opposite force at play. Youth populations are swelling, creating a kind of economic energy that is both unpredictable and unstoppable. Think of hundreds of millions of young people, connected by smartphones, eager to build, to innovate, to move beyond the limits of their parents' generation. They are not asking permission to participate in the global economy. They are demanding a seat at the table. In Africa alone, by the middle of the century, the population will double. With the majority under the age of 25, that means millions of new workers entering the labor force every year. Millions of new consumers creating demand for goods and services. Millions of new voices shaping culture and politics on a global scale. This is a demographic dividend that, once unlocked, cannot be contained within borders. The middle class is the bridge between these two extremes. And here lies another key to understanding why this global shift cannot be stopped. For the first time in human history, the majority of people on Earth are no longer in extreme poverty. Instead, they are entering a new social and economic class that prioritizes education, technology, healthcare, and stability. In Asia alone, over 500 million people have moved into the middle class in just the past 2 decades. This is not merely an economic statistic. It is a psychological one. When people move into the middle class, their outlook changes. They begin to believe that tomorrow will be better than today, that their children will achieve more than they could, that effort and ambition have meaning in a system that now includes them. This belief is the most powerful fuel for sustainable growth, and it is multiplying across continents. Now consider what happens when these 3 forces: aging populations in the West, booming youth in the developing world, and the rapid rise of a global middle class intersect. It creates both tension and opportunity. Aging societies will increasingly rely on young, vibrant populations abroad to sustain their economic models, whether through migration, outsourcing, or partnerships. Meanwhile, those young populations will look outward for opportunities, markets, and alliances that reward their energy and innovation. The middle class serves as the connecting tissue, creating global demand that cannot be contained by old borders. Together, they form a system of interdependence that no nation can escape. Demographics are destiny, but they are also disruption. As populations shift, industries must adapt or face irrelevance. Look at healthcare. An aging population drives demand for medical technology, elder care, and pharmaceuticals at levels that strain existing systems. Look at education. Booming youth populations create unprecedented pressure to build schools, train teachers, and provide access to digital learning platforms. Look at housing and urban planning. In older societies, cities must adapt to accommodate mobility and accessibility, while in younger societies, the challenge is building fast enough to meet the demand of rapid urbanization. These shifts are not optional. They are mandatory, because the numbers will not wait for policies to catch up. Some may believe that technology will somehow erase these demographic realities, that artificial intelligence or automation can substitute for declining populations in developed countries. But technology does not erase demographics. It interacts with them. Robots may replace some workers, but they cannot replace the economic dynamism of millions of young entrepreneurs or the consumer habits of a rising middle class. Digital platforms may streamline services, but they cannot reverse the fact that older populations vote differently, or that young populations demand opportunities that align with their aspirations. Technology amplifies demographics. It does not overwrite them. This is why the shift cannot be stopped. You can slow it, you can redirect parts of it, but you cannot hold back a wave once it has gathered force. Governments may try to erect barriers against migration, but if millions of people are seeking opportunity, history shows those walls eventually crumble. Economies may try to resist the influence of emerging markets, but when hundreds of millions of new consumers are demanding products, supply chains inevitably reorient to meet them. Political powers may attempt to preserve dominance, but when the majority of the world's population is younger, more connected, and increasingly affluent, that dominance naturally erodes. At its core, demographics reveal the truth about power in the 21st century. It no longer flows from those who wish to hold on to the past, but from those whose very existence points to the future. The young cannot be made old, and the old cannot be made young again. The middle class cannot unlearn its ambitions. These truths move silently beneath the surface of policy debates and market analysis, yet they dictate the direction of the world with a certainty that no one can fully resist. For centuries, power was defined by who controlled the resources, the land, the armies, or the banks. Access determined influence, and influence determined survival. The few who had access shaped the destinies of the many who did not. But we are living in an era where that entire equation has been rewritten. Technology has become the great equalizer of our time, tearing down walls that once separated the privileged from the powerless and placing tools of influence and creation into the hands of people who would never have been part of the system before. This is not just about progress, it is about a redistribution of power on a scale the world has never seen. In the past, starting a business required enormous amounts of capital, connections to the right people, and access to financial institutions that often favored only the elite. Today, a single person with nothing more than a smartphone and an internet connection can set up an online shop, reach customers on the other side of the globe, and process payments instantly. That is not a small change, it is a revolution. The traditional gatekeepers of wealth and opportunity no longer hold the keys exclusively, because the digital age has unlocked doors for billions of people who were once locked out of the system. Think about what happens when artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and mobile connectivity intersect. A farmer in a remote village can use satellite data to predict rainfall and maximize harvests, something that only the most advanced corporations could do in the past. A young entrepreneur with no physical office can build a global service, hire a virtual team, and scale faster than companies that once spent decades constructing brick and mortar infrastructure. Technology eliminates friction. It strips away layers of permission and bureaucracy, allowing the ideas of the individual to compete directly with the structures of the powerful and. This is where the shift becomes unstoppable. Once power flows into the hands of individuals and small groups, it cannot be taken back easily. The printing press once made knowledge accessible to millions, and it was impossible to reverse. The internet made information travel faster than any authority could regulate, and that too could not be undone. Now, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and digital platforms are extending that same principle into finance, communication, and production. They are creating networks of empowerment that operate beyond traditional borders and hierarchies. Consider finance as a clear example. Traditional banking systems were built on physical infrastructure, branches, ledgers, and the trust of established institutions. Today, digital wallets and decentralized finance platforms allow even those without a bank account to participate in global commerce. Millions of people in developing regions who were never included in the financial system are now active participants, sending money, saving, investing, and borrowing, all through their phones. This is more than inclusion, it is liberation. Once someone has tasted financial independence, they will never accept exclusion again. Technology also challenges the old monopoly of information once. Only media companies with massive budgets could reach wide audiences. Now, a single video posted by an unknown teenager can attract millions of views overnight. This redistribution of influence has reshaped politics, culture, and markets. Leaders who once controlled narratives through centralized channels now face direct competition from ordinary people with cameras and microphones. The power of storytelling has shifted away from institutions and into the hands of individuals who can reach the world instantly. That power is not reversible, because once people learn they have a voice, they never go back to silence. Education is another dimension of this equalization. Once knowledge was tied to geography. You had to live in the right city, attend the right university, and pay the right tuition. Today, courses from the best institutions in the world are accessible to anyone with an internet connection. A student in a small village can learn coding, design, or even advanced sciences from world-class professors at no cost. That does not just create opportunity, it creates competition. It ensures that talent is no longer confined to the elite, but distributed across the globe. This shift cannot be reversed, because once knowledge flows freely, it multiplies faster than any barrier can contain. Of course, technology also amplifies inequalities if access is uneven. Those who lack connectivity or infrastructure risk being left behind. But even here, the trend is in favor of expansion. Every year, more regions gain internet access, more devices become affordable, and more solutions emerge to connect the unconnected. Solar-powered mobile towers, community Wi-Fi hubs, and low-cost smartphones are spreading across regions once thought unreachable. The momentum is forward, not backward. And every new connection creates new potential for economic and social participation. This equalization is not without resistance. Institutions that once held control resist change, fearing the loss of authority. Governments impose restrictions on digital platforms. Banks warn against cryptocurrencies. Media conglomerates push back against independent voices. But history shows that such resistance is temporary. Once a technology demonstrates its usefulness and empowers millions, no regulation or barrier can permanently suppress it. Just as water finds its way around obstacles, technology flows into the cracks of society, spreading influence in ways that eventually overwhelm resistance. Technology is also reshaping the meaning of scale. In the industrial age, scale meant factories, land, and armies of workers. In the digital age, scale means networks, algorithms, and communities. A startup with 5 people and a strong algorithm can disrupt industries once controlled by giants. A single app can have more influence on global communication than entire governments. Scale is no longer tied to physical size, but to the capacity to connect and engage. That transformation redefines what it means to be powerful, and it cannot be undone. At the heart of this equalization is a profound shift in mindset. People who once felt powerless now believe they can shape their own destinies. They see technology not as a tool of the elite, but as their own instrument of progress. A generation raised on the internet views opportunity as borderless and innovation as limitless. That belief, once embedded, creates a momentum that no institution can reverse. Once people believe they can build, they will build. Once they believe they can lead, they will lead. For much of modern history, power was concentrated in the hands of a few dominant nations and the institutions they created. These powers wrote the rules of trade, dictated the flows of capital, and set the standards for diplomacy and security. Their currencies became the lifeblood of global commerce. Their military alliances served as the guardians of order, and their influence shaped the direction of global culture. But hegemony, by its very nature, is fragile. It depends not only on strength, but also on the belief of others in that strength. When belief erodes, when cracks begin to show in the foundation, even the greatest empires find themselves unable to maintain the same level of control. We are living in such a moment now. The decline of traditional hegemony is not a forecast or a theory. It is a reality unfolding before our eyes. Look closely at the international system that emerged after the Second World War. It was designed with one dominant goal: to ensure stability under the leadership of a small group of nations. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United Nations were built to reflect that order. They served their purpose for decades, but today their limitations are becoming clear. As the world has grown more interconnected, as emerging economies have risen, these institutions look increasingly outdated, unable to reflect the realities of a multipolar world. When countries representing billions of people feel their voices are excluded from the decision-making process, legitimacy begins to fade. And with it, the authority that once seemed unshakable. Consider the role of currency. For decades, one currency dominated international trade, serving as the global standard for exchange and reserves. That dominance gave its issuer unparalleled power, allowing it to influence global markets, impose sanctions, and sustain deficits without facing the same risks as others. But today, the world is diversifying. Nations are conducting trade in local currencies, creating alternative payment systems, and exploring digital currencies that bypass traditional networks altogether. This trend is not about politics alone. It is about practicality. When countries recognize that dependence on a single system exposes them to vulnerability, they naturally seek alternatives. Once those alternatives prove reliable, the old dominance begins to erode. Currency hegemony, once taken for granted, is no longer assured. Military power, too, tells a similar story. Once, a handful of alliances dominated global security, projecting influence across continents. Yet, in recent years, those alliances have been tested by internal divisions, by disagreements over priorities, and by the emergence of new regional powers. Unwilling to accept a subordinate role, conflicts in different parts of the world have shown that overwhelming force no longer guarantees victory, that asymmetry can undermine superiority, and that influence does not always come from the largest armies, but from strategic partnerships, technology, and public opinion. Military hegemony relies on both capability and credibility, and both are being questioned in ways that weaken the traditional order. The economic landscape underscores this shift even more dramatically. For decades, the flow of global capital favored a few advanced economies, with emerging markets seen as peripheral, dependent, or unstable. But today, those same emerging markets are engines of growth. Nations once dismissed as suppliers of raw materials are now producing technology, building infrastructure, and shaping the future of energy. Trade routes are being redrawn, with South-South commerce growing faster than traditional North-South flows. Entire regions once considered passive participants in globalization, are now active architects of new systems. This rebalancing is not temporary. It reflects a deeper truth that economic dynamism no longer resides exclusively in the old centers of power. Culture and values also play a role in the decline of hegemony. In the past, cultural influence flowed in one direction from the dominant nations outward. Movies, media, fashion, and ideas were exported and consumed globally, reinforcing the notion of superiority. But with digital platforms, that flow has reversed. Music, films, literature, and even social media trends from Africa, Asia, and Latin America now spread globally within hours. Cultural narratives are no longer dictated by a single source. They are fragmented, diverse, and reflective of local identities. This decentralization of culture undermines the ability of any one power to define the aspirations and ideals of the global population. What makes the decline of hegemony irreversible is the nature of interconnectedness. Once nations discover that they can trade, cooperate, and innovate outside the boundaries of traditional systems, they rarely go back. Once alliances form among emerging powers, they create their own gravity, attracting others who seek independence from old hierarchies. Once people experience cultural pride through the global recognition of their own voices, they no longer accept being defined by another's narrative. The momentum builds quietly but forcefully, pulling the world toward a multipolar order where no single actor can dictate the rules. The decline of traditional hegemony also stems from within. Nations that once dominated the system now face internal divisions, political polarization, and economic challenges that erode their ability to project strength outward. When societies are consumed by internal disputes, their capacity to lead globally diminishes. When economies struggle with debt, inequality, or declining competitiveness, their influence weakens. When the perception of unity and vision fades, others no longer look to them as reliable anchors. The appearance of strength matters as much as strength itself, and when that appearance cracks, global influence follows. This decline does not mean chaos, it means transition. Power is not disappearing, but redistributing. Influence is not vanishing, but spreading. A world where decisions are shaped by multiple centers of gravity may be more complex, but it also reflects the realities of today's demographics, economics, and technology. Multipolarity is not just a political concept. It is an economic inevitability, a cultural trend, and a demographic fact. The old structures cannot contain the energy of new participants forever. History reminds us that no hegemony has lasted forever. The empires of the past all believed their dominance would endure, yet each was replaced when the forces of change grew too strong to resist. The same cycle is unfolding now, not through conquest, but through the silent weight of demographics, technology, and economics. The decline of traditional hegemony is the natural consequence of a world where billions are empowered, connected, and unwilling to remain silent. It is not a question of if, but of when. And the answer is already revealing itself in every trade agreement signed outside old systems, every payment made in local currencies, every alliance forged without approval from traditional powers, and every voice that finds an audience across digital networks. Every major transformation in human history has been driven not only by shifts in economics or politics, but by the rise of new values that redefine what people aspire to and how they choose their leaders. In past centuries, power was concentrated in those who controlled resources, land, or armies. Leaders were often measured by their ability to dominate, to command, to enforce. But in the world we live in today, the definition of leadership is undergoing a profound change. It is no longer just about wealth or force, but about the ability to connect, to inspire, and to embody the values that matter to new generations. This is one of the most powerful signs that the global shift cannot be stopped, because once societies begin to believe in new principles, the structures built on old ones inevitably weaken, the younger generations. Now, the largest demographic group across much of the world see life differently than their parents. Their values are shaped by a world of connectivity, instant access to information, and global interaction. They grew up witnessing crises of climate, inequality, and conflict. And as a result, they place a higher premium on sustainability, fairness, and innovation than on tradition or hierarchy. For them, success is not measured by the accumulation of power for its own sake, but by the ability to create impact, to solve problems, and to improve the world in tangible ways. This generational shift in priorities is irreversible because values, once adopted widely, reshape institutions, markets, and governments. Sustainability is perhaps the clearest example where past generations often treated natural resources as unlimited and external costs. As invisible, young people today see environmental stewardship as non-negotiable. They want leaders who take responsibility for the future, not those who exploit the present at the expense of generations to come. Corporations that ignore this are already paying the price, losing market share to competitors who embrace green practices and transparency. Nations that dismiss environmental concerns face resistance not only from activists but also from consumers, investors, and international partners. This is not simply a moral issue, it is an economic reality. As new values rise, they change the flow of capital, the direction of innovation, and the credibility of leadership itself. Innovation is another defining value in the past. Leadership often meant preserving systems, traditions, and hierarchies. Stability was prized above experimentation. But today, stability without progress feels like stagnation. Young generations demand leaders who embrace disruption, who are willing to experiment, fail, and adapt. They admire those who create solutions rather than those who maintain old systems. This has redefined what leadership looks like in every field, from politics to business to culture. A leader today is not necessarily the one with the longest resume, but the one with the most compelling vision for the future and the ability to mobilize people toward it. This explains why so many new leaders emerge from unexpected places. A startup founder challenging an industry giant, a community organizer reshaping political debates, a digital creator influencing millions with a single message. Authority is no longer inherited or granted by institutions. It is earned by resonance with the values of the people. Collaboration has also become central to the new definition of leadership. In the industrial age, hierarchies dominated command, and control systems worked in factories and armies, and so they shaped broader ideas of leadership. But in the digital age, where networks matter more than structures, collaboration is the currency of influence. Leaders are expected to build partnerships, to work across borders, and to engage diverse voices. This is a radical shift from the past, and it reflects the values of a generation raised in a connected world. They do not see borders as barriers to cooperation. They see them as opportunities to create bridges. As this mindset spreads, it creates leaders who prioritize dialogue over dominance and inclusion over exclusion. It is important to note that the rise of new values does not mean the disappearance of old forms of power. Wealth and force still matter, but they are no longer enough to guarantee legitimacy. A government may control its citizens through coercion, but it cannot win their loyalty if it ignores their values. A company may dominate an industry with resources, but it cannot sustain its growth if consumers abandon it for being out of touch. Traditional power without alignment to modern values becomes brittle, vulnerable to disruption, and incapable of inspiring. That is why we see long-established institutions struggling to maintain relevance, while new players, armed not with centuries of legacy, but with alignment to emerging values, gain influence at astonishing speed. This transformation is most visible in the way leadership is distributed. In the past, leadership was concentrated in a small circle of elites who controlled access to information and resources. Today, leadership is dispersed. A teenager with a phone can spark a global movement. A grassroots initiative can influence the agenda of international institutions. Influence is no longer centralized. And as a result, leadership has become more fluid, more dynamic, and more representative of the diversity of human experience. This distribution of leadership ensures that no single ideology or institution can monopolize the global conversation. Instead, new leaders rise continuously, reflecting the evolving values of their communities. The rise of new values also shifts how legitimacy is measured. For much of the last century, legitimacy came from economic growth or military strength. But now, people are increasingly asking, does this leader reflect our values? Does this company serve more than profit? Does this institution solve the problems of our time? When the answers are no, legitimacy erodes, regardless of material power. This erosion is not slow. In the age of digital communication, it can happen overnight. Trust once lost is nearly impossible to recover, and new leaders are quick to step into the vacuum. This accelerates the decline of old powers and the rise of new ones. What makes this shift unstoppable is that values are not imposed from the top down, they grow from the ground up. They emerge from lived experience, from cultural exchange, from the aspirations of ordinary people. Leaders who align with these values are lifted up, while those who resist them are gradually sidelined. No decree, no force, no strategy can change what millions of people believe is right. And once values change, they change everything. The way people buy, the way they vote, the way they work, the way they dream. This transformation guarantees that the next generation of leaders will look nothing like the last, and that the structures of power will continue to shift toward those who embody the ideals of sustainability, innovation, collaboration, and inclusivity.